First, I want to touch on this topic before we get to the main courses later. It's the topic I've heard you mention on your social media, which is the collapse, the spiritual collapse of humanity. How would we define that concept? What is it due to?
Well, in Kabbalah, there is a concept called Tikkun Olam. Tikkun means rectification, Olam means the world, so it means the rectification of the world. When the soul incarnates in this world, in the physical body, it completely loses the memory of its true nature. By doing so, it starts to be dominated by the passions of the body, by ignorance, and then it begins to make short circuits and to be clumsy. Let's say, because it doesn't have the knowledge. And that creates even more things to correct, along with those it had already brought to be reincarnated. So, there are two processes. There's an individual process, which is the process of individual rectification, called tikkun, which means rectification, and then there's tikkun olam, which is the process of collective rectification, which is the sum of all the souls rectifying themselves in this world. Spiritual collapse. Why? Because we are at a moment, and there, for me, 2020 was key to that great and truly spiritual collapse, in which the forces of evil, which, as we have already seen, play a fundamental role in our training as a soul, hit the mark, absolutely, to, let's say, bring down many, I wasn't going to say all, but many of the layers of the ego, even though the ego is necessary to be in this world, but many of the layers that the ego has, of rigid structures, of very rigid ways of seeing life, and it invited us to see reality in a very different way. Many of us, myself included, regardless of whether we could truly see what was happening or not. We underwent a major spiritual transformation due to a spiritual collapse, because those social, economic, belief, psychological manipulation, and psychological structures collapsed before our eyes, in others, and often in ourselves as well, in such a way that it was a very important turning point, which allows us to rebuild ourselves as human beings from a much more interesting perspective. So, the spiritual collapse of humanity is very important because it allows you to rebuild yourself on an individual level as a human being. In Kabbalah, we say Adam, but Adam doesn't mean the first man Adam, it means something else in Kabbalah. In Kabbalah, Adam represents the highest level of consciousness a person can reach. In other words, it's like the top of the potential you can aspire to in terms of consciousness. Of course, reaching that level of consciousness necessarily involves going through a destruction, a collapse. For example, in Tarot, the Tower card symbolizes destruction when the towers fall. Here, many beliefs have been destroyed and continue to be destroyed, you know? Internal fortresses that we thought were strongholds, but it turns out they were built on feet of clay. The forces of evil make us see this, and we have to be smart enough to adapt and rebuild ourselves from within, with much stronger pillars. Considering that all those kinds of events we experienced in 2020 can happen, no one expected something like that. And all of that will make us, in the end, not weaker, but much stronger. And that we have much more depth in the analysis we can make of the events that happen to us in our lives, which are real challenges every day. Challenges with our partner, with friends, with parents, with children. If we are stronger, we will be able to face it in a much more solid way. So to wrap up my answer, I would say that the spiritual collapse of humanity is a fact. But from that, we move on to a much greater and much more powerful level of consciousness, which gives us much stronger spiritual pillars.
I understand, Raul. So to sum up a little the idea you just gave me, and correct me if I'm wrong, if maybe I haven't interpreted something correctly or I haven't understood something well, do you mean that this spiritual collapse largely has a more massive origin, or that it affected the macro environment more in 2020? Because many structures that were once used or have always been historically used to subdue the population, to keep them deceived, to keep them within a fold, fell apart for those who were open to seeing it.
Exactly, and it's very interesting that in the end, the main tool of psychological manipulation is fear. And that's how it's always been and always will be. But what's curious in this case is that, let's say the people, the number, A large number of people who were realizing that this didn't make sense, well, these people who realized it were really surprised. And they also collapsed. Above all, these people collapsed on a spiritual level in disbelief at what they were seeing, at how the rest of the people were reacting. I don't know if it takes me to everything.
Totally, I'm one of those people and I'm another. I collapsed.
Yeah, me too.
I collapsed there, I did. That's when I realized that in this world, we're playing a much darker game than people could ever even imagine. But speaking of 2020, I wasn't ready for this, but it happens. How Raul, Duran, an expert in Kabbalah, relates the events that happened that year to spiritual matters.
It has a very direct relationship, because in Kabbalah there's a concept, the concept of Mashiach, the Messiah. Mashiach in Hebrew. In the previous podcast, I already explained that one of the Kabbalistic tools is to permute letters within a word to make leaps in consciousness, because the word acquires a new meaning. So Mashiach, you can read it by permuting the letters as Yesh Moach in Hebrew. There is brain, there is understanding. That's Mashiach. In other words, have you understood, have you realized something very powerful that has taken you to another level of consciousness? What do you need to reach the Mashiach level or Messiah, your own inner Messiah? Well, you need an equivalent, but on the negative side. And interestingly, now we're going to apply a Kabbalistic mechanism, which is Gematria. Mashiach has a numerical value of 358 in the numbering of the word. Nahash is another word meaning serpent, referring to the serpent from paradise mentioned in Genesis. The bad side, the Sitra Hara, the other side, the perverse side, has the same gematria. It means that both need each other, because the Nahash, which is the reptilian brain in us, the one that controls survival, is implanted there by the force of evil, to press a button and make us react with fear. It has the motivation, the obligation, and the goal to do that. But for what purpose? To make your inner Mashiach emerge? To make you stronger, to make you more resistant, to make you more resilient, to make you, well, spiritually much more elevated. And that's where we connect with the concept of Adam. When the moment comes when you no longer need events that are harsh blows from life, then you will be reaching a level Adam. That is, you don't necessarily have to go through suffering or harsh blows in life to grow spiritually. However, it's obvious and evident that in most cases that's how it is. Why? Because we live in a constant carnival. The carnival never stops. There are so many distractions, and since we live in a constant carnival and there are so many distractions, we don't stop to review our own internal process of growing awareness. When we do so, it's only because we've taken a serious hit. And don't think that review lasts very long either, because right away, like carnival, something else comes along. Does that catch your attention? And we have to have enough spiritual strength not to fall into the distraction of the carnival. Sure, the carnival is fine and there. We have to be able to see the masks and who is behind those masks. We even have to be able to see our own mask, our character, our essence. And what distance is there between the mask and the essence? Which is often a lot, and when it's a lot. Then we have to encourage a rapprochement to achieve a balance. We have to walk toward our essence. That is humanity's spiritual collapse I mentioned earlier, and it's the process of rectification. We need the mask and the ego, but it has to be very close to the essence, and that is our work in this world.